This anime begins by showing a young man named Hazama Kuru, who has black and white hair and many stitches on his body. He is a surgeon known as Dr. Blackjack. The next scene reveals a protest at the University of Tokyo in 1968 that ended in riots between students and police. The scene moves to the university hospital, where Okamoto Maiko worked as an internship doctor. As an intern, she had a lot of work to do. She was so exhausted that she dropped the files in her hands. After completing the task, Maiko looked out the window where the medical students rallied in front of the hospital. Soon after, a senior doctor called her to come to the ER room because there were many patients to treat. Apparently, the university hospital lacked internship doctors, so Maiko was asked to help doctors to treat patients who had just arrived. Over time, the number of patients increased, so the senior doctor asked her to find another intern to help in the ER. Maiko went to meet the protesters to find an intern willing to serve. Unfortunately, no one wanted to help. Then she saw a medical student who was practicing how to dissect patients. He was Hazama, the guy who appeared in the early scene. Maiko knew that Hazama was a famous strange student on his campus. But she had no other choice and immediately invited him to help to treat patients in the ER. Hazama was willing to assist and follow Maiko to the ER room. There, Maiko watched him treat patients and admired his thoroughness. Shortly after, a seriously injured patient came, the victim of an accident on the railroad tracks. The professor arrived to see the condition of the boy whose hands and feet were crushed. Seeing his critical condition, the professor concluded that he should be amputated. The kid's parents were shocked to hear the doctor's statement. They were crying and making Hazama feel sorry for them. He then approached the boy and saw his condition. After analyzing it for a while, Hazama confidently told the kid's parents that he could cure their son and reattach the broken arms and legs as long as they gave him permission. But Hazama applied for a condition to be paid high. Without further thinking, the kid's parents accepted Hazama's terms. Hazama then invited the patient to the hospital where his friend worked. Maiko also went with Hazama to supervise the medical student. Upon arrival at the hospital, Hazama saw that his friend was stressed. He was Yabu, a doctor who turned out to be a drug addict. Hazama asked Yabu and Maiko to help him in the operating room. He also offered a sum of money as a rental to Yabu. At first, there was a rejection from Yabu, so they argued. But finally, Yabu agreed to Hazama to take the patient to his operating room. The scene then shows Hazama operating on the patient, and Maiko is amazed at his expertise in surgery, even though he is still a medical student. Sometime later, the boy finally survived, and his hands and feet were successfully reattached. Maiko and Yabu, who previously looked tense, were relieved. However, after performing the operation, Hazama was shaking and scared of what he had done. Yabu then brought him tea to make him relax. Yabu knew that the boy was the first person Hazama operated on. He congratulated Hazama for successfully performing his surgery. After that, the boy's father approached Hazama and instead gave him a small amount of money. He knew that Hazama was a student, not a doctor, so he underestimated Hazama. He even said that Hazama was all sorts of things, then he would report it to the police. Hearing that, Hazama was speechless. He gave the money from the man to Yabu, saying that the money was rent for the operating room. Yabu felt bad because Hazama did not get anything after operating on the boy. Maiko also did not accept to see the boy's parents, who would cancel the agreement with Hazama. But Hazama chose to leave the room, and upon closing the door, his face looked very angry at the boy's parents. The scene then shows Hazama and the other men had been taken hostage simultaneously. Hazama just remembered that he was kidnapped and given dope to faint last night. The men who were with him were afraid that they would be killed. Soon a sly-looking man appeared who turned out to be a moneylender boss named Tachiri. Hazama asked what his purpose of gathering them. Tachiri laughed while saying that those in the room owed him a lot, including Hazama, who owed him 300 million. So, he gathered them to reclaim his money. Hazama again asked him what he would do to them, and with a sly face, he said that he wanted the heart organs in their body. Knowing that they would be killed, they were terrified. But Tachiri explained that their hearts would be exchanged for other hearts, so they wouldn't die. After Tachiri left, Hazama looked at Yabu and asked why he seemed so calm. Yabu replied that he deserved to die because, during his life, he did terrible things and even pawned his father's hospital. Soon, Tachiri returned to the room and announced that only 2 people had passed the test. Tachiri then pointed to Hazama and a strange man named Raymond. He then ordered the others to leave. After staying alone in the room, Hazama asked Tachiri about the doctor who would operate on them. He then explained his theory that an African cardiac surgeon named Bernard had a transplant. After a few weeks, the patient who had Bernard's surgery died, and he was declared a failure. Tachiri smiled while handing Hazama the doctor's card. He was Dr. Joker from the underworld. Sometime later, an old man entered the room with his assistant. Tachiri introduced the man as a sect leader named Kanayama to Mizo. Kanayama was the first patient to receive a heart transplant from Hazama and Raymond. Hazama was very angry because Tachiri dared to trade organs for money. Kanayama underestimated Hazama while throwing money at him. But suddenly Yabu returned to the room and tried to save Hazama, but the guards immediately captured him. Soon after, Tachiri's men came and told him Dr. Joker was missing because the government was looking for him. Hearing that, Tachiri freaked out because their plan would fail. He intended to leave and cancel the transaction. However, Kanayama's sect's followers arrested Tachiri and threatened that they would kill him if their leader was not operated on. This made Tachiri cornered and confused about what to do. Still, Tachiri then remembered that Hazama was a medical student, so he appointed Hazama to dissect the head of the sect. At first, Hazama refused to do it, but Raymond asked sincerely for him to do the operation. Raymond then told him that he was a foreigner who came to Japan illegally to get a job. But after arriving in Japan, he couldn't find a job, so he got stuck owing to Tachiri. He also said that he did this to save his daughter, who suffered from leukemia. Hearing Raymond's heartbreaking story, Hazama finally wanted to operate on Kanayama and Raymond. Before conducting the dissection, Hazama checked the health data of the two people. Soon, he was in the operating room to perform his task as a doctor. But Yabu didn't support Hazama's action and tried to stop him. Hazama insisted on continuing the operation, but Yabu started advising him not to kill the patient because he was a doctor. Shortly after, Raymond's heartbeat suddenly stopped. Hazama immediately wore a pacemaker to save Raymond. Hazama repeatedly paced Raymond's heart to beat again, and it worked. On the other hand, Hazama began into a dilemma and was conscious of Yabu's words. The scene switches to a few days after the surgery, where Hazama sits in the garden with Kanayama. Soon after, Yabu came to join them. But it turned out that the one sitting with Hazama was Raymond, whose face had been operated on to become Kanayama, while the real Kanayama had died in the operating room. Hazama did it for fear of being killed by Kanayama's followers. He operated on Raymond's face to become the sect leader's face, and in the end, they survived. Raymond could now save his daughter and earn money for being a sect leader. He thanked Hazama for his help, but Hazama also thanked Yabu. Hazama said if Yabu didn't warn him, maybe he would do something terrible and ruin his career as a doctor. Yabu blushed at Hazama's praise. Most importantly, Yabu and Hazama could get out of a dangerous situation and be able to resume their lives. The scene then shows Maiko visiting Hazama's house. She was curious about Hazama's intelligence. Upon arrival at Hazama's house, Maiko saw that Hazama lived in a slum apartment, and there was nothing special. But she saw a fish in the aquarium that had been operated on by Hazama. Maiko was again amazed to see his skill in using animals for training. Shortly after, Maiko heard people whimpering, and she asked Hazama to check. She met a young man named Tamura next to Hazama's apartment. Tamura greeted Hazama and said that he was Hazama's junior at high school. He asked Hazama for help to check on his sick friend, but Hazama refused because he was just a medical student. But Tamura kept begging him to look at his friend's condition. Maiko finally said she would check on Tamura's friend because she was an internship doctor. Arriving in the room, Maiko checked Tamura's friend's condition. He was a foreigner named Smith, who was critical. Maiko then asked Hazama to check his condition. The scene moves to show Hazama and the others in the operating room provided by the activists. Hazama was suspicious of Smith's illness, so he asked Tamura to call an ambulance. But a woman named Aoyama, who was also in Tamura's room, refused because they were anti-military activists. If the hospital found out, Smith and his friend Marlon would be arrested. There it was explained that Smith and Marlon were defectors and fugitives wanted by the government. If Smith is taken to the hospital, then it will threaten the lives of activists such as Aoyama and Tamura. Hazama felt that Aoyama and Tamura were too selfish and concerned only with their opinions. He decided to go alone and call an ambulance. When Hazama was about to leave the operating room, Aoyama pointed a gun at Hazama and threatened him not to call an ambulance. But Hazama was not afraid and continued to step on his feet to leave the room. Aoyama and Tamura intended to flee before Hazama called an ambulance. But Maiko stopped them because Smith's current condition was indeed critical. On the other hand, Hazama was arguing with his conscience about his action of not saving the patient's life. Hazama explained that he was just a student instead of a doctor, while the other side of Hazama insisted that he had to save the patient, despite the high risk because the doctor's job was to save the patient. Hazama returned to the operating room a little later and said he would operate on Smith. Hearing that, Maiko decided to help him operate on Smith. When washing her hands, Maiko asked if Hazama could operate on the patient's skull. Hazama said this was the first time he had performed skull surgery, but he was still sure to do it because he wanted to be like Dr. Hama, who had saved his life. Hazama then entered the operating room with Maiko and started an operation. Hazama would open Smith's skull to remove the fluid from his head. The operation lasted quite a while, but Smith was finally saved, and sometime later, he regained consciousness. Smith then recalled what happened to him when he began to feel headaches in the face of the Vietnam War. Marlon was relieved to see Smith's condition. He then said a medical student saved Smith by operating on his head. But Smith was shocked to hear that because he doubted Hazama's expertise. He immediately asked Marlon to report to the CIA that he was now injured. The scene turns to Smith being handled by a professional doctor. The doctor then went to see Hugo, the head of the CIA. Smith was previously treated by a great doctor, so he was saved. Hugo told him that the one who saved Smith was a medical student from Japan. The doctor was amazed to see Hazama, who was still a student. After the incident, Hugo asked the Japanese police to wipe out the scandal. The conflict ended, and Smith's criminal record in Japan had been cleared as well as other deserters. The scene again shows Hazama, who has been released from prison, after illegally helping a foreigner. But strangely, only Hazama was arrested, while Michael and Tamura were not detained or questioned by the police. Out of jail, Hazama still wondered about the reason for his helping Smith. After seeing Hazama's heroic act, Yabu's instinct as a doctor was summoned. He said goodbye to Hazama because he was going to Vietnam to become a volunteer doctor. Sometime later, Hazama accidentally saw the news on television about the hospital where Yabu worked that was destroyed by the war. Therefore, he decided to go after Yabu to Vietnam to find him. Upon arrival in Vietnam, Hazama stood in front of the location of the destroyed hospital. He then decided to stop by a restaurant for lunch before continuing his journey. In the place, Hazama met a reporter named Takayanagi, who apparently also knew Yabu. They had lunch together. Takayanagi then explained that Yabu could move to another village in the Dalat area before the bombing. He also told Hazama about the long war that took place in Vietnam. The tensions between the United States forces and Viet Cong were rising, especially in the Dalat region. Hearing that, Hazama asked how he could get to Dalat. Takayanagi was in shock and warned Hazama that they were in Vietnam in the middle of a war, which was very dangerous. Suddenly, there was a gunshot outside, so Hazama and Takayanagi rushed away to see what was happening. It turned out that there were soldiers who had shot civilians dead. Shortly after, the soldiers arrived and attacked the reporters covering the incident. Hazama took care of the victims injured by the soldiers' brutal actions. Takayanagi told Hazama that in Vietnam, human life was cheaper than a pebble. Hazama then asked him why he still survived in Vietnam. Takayanagi replied that he wanted to show the atrocities in Vietnam to the world. Hearing this, Hazama decided to keep going to Dalat village, looking for Yabu. Takayanagi was touched by Hazama's firm determination. He said he would help Hazama go to Dalat with his American friend. The following day, Takayanagi introduced Hazama to his two friends, Bob and Fan. Bob was an American soldier, while Fan was a civilian serving as a guide. They started a trip to Dalat by tank. On their way, Takayanagi asked Hazama how he had come to Vietnam so easily. Takayanagi also said if Hazama had a friend there, he could survive. Hazama recalled asking Raymond for help so he could arrive quickly in Vietnam. While crossing the forest, the American army was attacked by Vietnamese troops, resulting in a shootout at the site. One by one, the American forces were shot dead, then the Vietnamese troops fired cannons at the American troops' tanks so that the tanks were turned upside down. While Bob and the others managed to hide to protect themselves, Hazama was still at the war site because his operating gear bag fell off. He was about to take it but couldn't because Vietnamese army troops continued to shoot. On the other hand, one of the American soldiers named Steve was injured by gunfire, and his veins burst. At first, Hazama hesitated to save Steve on the battlefield. After recalling Yabu's words, Hazama's instinct arose, and without hesitation, he walked onto the battlefield to retrieve his bags and treat Steve. He intended to stop Steve's bleeding by doing a small operation. Takayanagi was moved to see Hazama's heroic action and photographed it while Bob continued to protect Hazama from the Vietnamese fire. Throughout the operation, Hazama only focused on Steve regardless of the war happening before his eyes. After the operation, Hazama and the others were captured by Vietnamese troops. They were taken to the headquarters of the Vietnamese soldiers. Instead of being scared, Hazama was happy that he could save Steve. The next scene shows Hazama and the American army being held in the basement. Hazama was brutally tortured by the Vietnamese army, forcing him to admit he was an American. Hazama always denied that he was not an American. In fact, he was a Japanese who arrived in Vietnam to find his friend. But Hazama's answer made him tortured and fall unconscious. Hazama returned to his cell with Takayanagi and the rest of the American army. After a while, Hazama awakened, and Takayanagi immediately asked him why he looked so calm and not scared at all. Hazama replied that he had experienced the same thing. When he was 8 years old, his body was once separated from his other organs due to a bomb attack. He was saved by Dr. Hama, and his body was successfully reattached. But the process took a long time to recover. Hazama had to crawl because his body had not functioned properly. After hearing the story, Takayanagi remembered Dr. Hama's story about the boy he had saved. Takayanagi did not expect it to be the story Hazama experienced. Sometime later, the Vietnamese soldiers took Fan away to be tortured, thus making Bob a little rebellious because Fan was his friend and she was a woman. When they interrogated Fan, another soldier showed up with a message that they would start an attack tonight. He ordered Fan to be put back in the cell. However, it appears that the man who brought Fan gave her the key and whispered something. Getting back into the cell, Fan told Bob and the others that they would run away tonight. She showed the key and immediately uncuffed the others. They managed to get out and start walking through the forest so they wouldn't get caught by the Vietnamese. While walking, Hazama asked Fan how she could get the key. Fan explained that a Japanese doctor had helped her so they could survive the Vietnamese army. Hazama immediately thought that the doctor was Yabu. They made a long journey, thirsty and hungry for many days until they finally fainted. The scene changes to show Hazama, who woke up from fainting and was in a house. It turned out that Fan looked for the people around and met Yabu, so Hazama and the others could survive. Yabu asked why Hazama came all the way to Vietnam. Hazama replied sincerely that he intended to find him because he saw on TV that his hospital was blown up. Hearing this, Yabu was moved and cried because Hazama was willing to look for him in the conflict area, even almost sacrificing his life. Hazama then asked Yabu about their other colleagues, and they were fine except for Steve. Hazama immediately saw Steve's critical condition and intended to conduct a recovery operation. But his intention was delayed due to insufficient equipment to perform the operation. At the same time, Bob showed up, cut off their conversation, and asked Yabu to give him a radio communication. He sought the help of a medical team from the United States based in Vietnam. Soon, the United States troops sent a senior doctor to their area in a fighter aircraft. The senior doctor landed using his troops and medical devices. There was an argument between Hazama and the senior doctor. They were jostling for a position to operate on Steve. Since Hazama was just a medical student without a license, he lost to the senior doctor. In the operating room, the senior doctor started his work with Yabu as an assistant, while Hazama just watched them. During the operation, Hazama saw Yabu, who was very different from the old Yabu. He was amazed because now Yabu looked calm and not afraid of blood. On the other hand, Hazama was also amazed to see the senior doctor, who looked very professional and reliable. Even the stitches were very smooth and fast. The senior doctor gave directions to Yabu on good treatment techniques and surgical methods, then the doctor used polymer film instead of gauze to cover the stitches. This also made Hazama know the new methods in medicine. Finally, the surgery was completed and went well. The scene switches to the senior doctor taking a break outside the cottage to enjoy the beauty of the night. Shortly after, Hazama came to the doctor and praised his skills while performing the surgery. The senior doctor also praised Hazama for providing Steve with first aid. The following day, Steve woke up and realized he was in a residential area. He turned out to be mentally impaired and not fully conscious, which made him wander. He walked through the rice fields without a clear mind because he was still traumatized by his time on the battlefield. Bob and Hazama then looked for Steve, who had escaped from the residential area. They saw Steve in the middle of the rice fields, talking alone. Bob told him they were safe so he wouldn't be afraid anymore. When Steve heard Bob's voice, he was about to return to meet Bob. Unfortunately, he stepped on a mine that made his body explode, and he died instantly. Steve's body was taken to the resident's house, while Bob turned out to be mentally ill because of Steve's departure. He still wished Steve could be saved. Fan tried to remind him that Steve had died by stepping on a mine. Shortly after, a villager called the senior doctor and asked him to check on the injured victim, who was bleeding and had to be operated on. Bob still didn't accept that they ignored Steve, so he forbade the senior doctor. Hazama tried to stop Bob's ridiculous attitude because the patient was his first priority for him. Fan then told Bob that the man was and he was her childhood friend. He was the one who gave them the keys to escape from the Vietnamese army base. Fan then asked the senior doctor and Hazama to rescue him from his critical condition. The doctor asked Yabu and the others to prepare the operating room and ordered Fan to take blood stock in the cooling room. Bob still didn't take it and went into the woods upset. He instead told the American troops to attack the settlements. Fan and Takayanagi noticed Bob's doing and tried to stop him, but it was too late. The crazy Bob even accused Fan of being a Viet Cong army spy. He then said that in 30 minutes, the place would be a sea of fire. On the other hand, the senior doctors, Yabu and Hazama, were performing N's rescue operation. The senior doctor gave directions to Hazama to operate on a patient suffering from a gunshot wound. Soon, Takayanagi told the senior doctor that Bob had contacted the American army to attack the village. Hearing this, the senior doctor asked Hazama and Yabu whether they would continue the surgery. They replied confidently that they indeed had to save the patient's life. The senior doctor laughed and said that they would still operate on him. Takayanagi praised them as great people. But the three men explained that they were doctors. He then left to inform the villagers to evacuate immediately and leave the village. The villagers were directed to the mountains to stay away from the town and gather there. Meanwhile, Bob was busy with Steve's body and walking around the fields. In the operating room, senior doctors with Hazama performed a combined operation assisted by Yabu. Seeing that, Yabu felt that they would both be great doctors in the future. The operation continued while the airborne troops were almost at the village. Soon, the senior doctor and his friends finished the operation, but the missiles attacked the town and turned it into a sea of fire. On the other hand, Takayanagi, Fan, and villagers hoped that doctors and others would survive the explosion, even though, at first, Fan thought they had died. But Fan was wrong. She saw the team of doctors survive the explosion while carrying the patient on a stretcher. The scene turns to Yabu driving Hazama to the airport to return to Japan. Yabu chose to stay in Vietnam to continue helping the wounded in the war. Yabu and Hazama also wondered about the senior American doctor considering he never introduced himself. The next scene switches to show a refugee camp where a soldier meets the senior doctor because there is a new patient. It was later explained that the senior doctor was Kiryo, a war medical team from the United States. After Hazama returned to Japan, Maiko invited him to see an operation performed by a famous doctor, Riesenberg, in the United States. Maiko seemed happy to see the doctor's skills. In addition, she was relieved because Hazama survived Vietnam, and he remembered the incident he experienced there. Meanwhile, journalists were seen surrounding a black man. Hazama and Maiko also noticed the man they didn't recognize. Soon, Maiko's friend, Tiara, arrived. The black man greeted her. Apparently, he was Johnny, an activist and Tiara's childhood friend. After that, the four of them were in the restaurant. Two gangsters appeared and asked Johnny to join them. Johnny refused because he hated acts of violence. One of the gangsters immediately beat up Johnny and forced Yohani to join him. They took Tiara hostage, and she was hit by a shot. Hazama did not remain silent, and immediately stabbed the hand of the gangster member holding Tiara hostage with a dinner knife. After that, they took Tiara to the hospital for surgery. Johnny's hand was seriously injured and had to be operated on immediately. But the hospital lacked doctors, so they could not operate on Johnny. Then Dr. Riesenberg showed up and volunteered to help Johnny. Maiko and Hazama also decided to help Dr. Riesenberg to do surgery. Dr. Riesenberg thanked Hazama after they had done. Maiko was happy because they had collaborated with the doctor. Maiko and Hazama then visited Johnny, unconscious after the operation. Hazama felt something strange in Johnny's body because it was slow to stimulate pain. Hazama explained to Johnny the theory of someone who was not sensitive to pain. Johnny told Hazama and Maiko that he had to protect black people's pride. They had always been oppressed during this time. The black race had been attacked from any side, whether white people or the media. Afterward, Hazama discussed Johnny's illness with Maiko outdoors. Maiko said that they couldn't let Johnny continue to hurt himself, and Hazama implied that Johnny's disease was rare and no cure had been found. Therefore, Maiko and Hazama first intended to find the cause of Johnny's illness. The following day, Johnny visited Tiara in the treatment room. He asked about her condition after seeing Tiara's sad face. She replied that she wanted Johnny to stop being an activist because he only hurt himself. Tiara also found out that Johnny had analgesia, which caused his body to slowly respond late to pain. Soon, Maiko and Hazama arrived in Tiara's room. Maiko then asked Johnny to be treated to cure his illness, but he refused and did not want to be treated. Tiara wept at Johnny's condition and asked him to treat his illness. Seeing Tiara's crying, Johnny relented and was willing to be examined by Hazama. But Johnny said that if Hazama did not find the cause, he had to give up. Hazama agreed with his terms and promised to find the cause of his disease. On the other hand, Yabu was seen with a man named Tommy, who had just landed at the United States airport. They stayed at the hotel to rest. That night, Tommy had a nightmare. Yabu tried calming him down by saying they had arrived in America. Hearing that, Tommy was aware and relieved that they had moved out of the battlefield. The following day, Tommy and Yabu met Dr. Riesenberg at Birmingham Hospital. Dr. Riesenberg opened a recovery practice for post-war trauma sufferers there. Yabu brought Tommy in for an examination. Yabu again met Hazama, who looked very tired and fell asleep on Yabu's shoulder. Afterward, Yabu, Hazama, and Maiko gathered in the hospital canteen. Hazama told Yabu about Johnny's illness and said he had not found the cause. Soon, Tommy came to Yabu and met Hazama and Maiko. Tommy told them that he had just met his old friend, Johnny, at the hospital. Hazama asked him to say to him about Johnny to learn about his illness. Johnny has been deceiving him all this time because he never went to Vietnam to fight. After learning the facts from Tommy, Hazama was very upset and immediately went to Johnny's room. He told Johnny that he had learned of his illness and threatened him by saying he would amputate his legs and hands. Johnny was shocked because he did not want to. Hazama still insists on continuing to amputate his legs and hands. If it's not done immediately, Johnny's life is in danger. Eventually, Johnny admitted that he had never been to Vietnam but joined the military, which set up a camp in Okinawa. The place was built exactly as it was in Vietnam. Johnny and the rest of the troops were used as the object of training experiments for military research. After hearing his confession, Hazama suspected that Johnny's analgesia was caused by a military experiment. The scene switches to Dr. Riesenberg in his room, where Hogo visited him. Dr. Riesenberg was surprised because it took Hazama only 3 days to diagnose Johnny's illness. When Hazama consulted with Dr. Riesenberg in his room, Dr. Riesenberg was even more surprised and amazed to see his research of discovering the cause of Johnny's illness, toxic gas. Hugo also told Dr. Riesenberg that Johnny was exposed to poisonous gas created by the Nazis. He added that the chemical weapon was used during Okinawa training, so Johnny was exposed to the effect. He also said that Hazama was a genius student studying Japanese medicine, and Dr. Riesenberg was more surprised to learn that Hazama was still a student. Hugo continued that Hazama actually often performs illegal operations. Hearing that, Dr. Riesenberg remembered when he was young, he had the ambition to become a doctor. He also feared that Hazama was involved with people from the underworld and criminals because of science's hunger. Dr. Riesenberg then asked Hugo what he would do to Johnny, and he replied that he would eliminate him because he would be a military threat with his illness. He would make Hazama a doctor who did illegal things in the underworld. Hearing that, Dr. Riesenberg immediately asked Hugo not to do so. But Hugo threatened him, so he could no longer argue. After the incident, Dr. Riesenberg went to Hazama and asked him to return to Japan immediately and not get involved with Johnny's problem anymore. It was Dr. Riesenberg himself who would treat Johnny. After Hazama and Maiko returned to Japan, Tiara sent a letter to Maiko, who immediately gave it to Hazama. After reading the letter, Hazama discovered that Johnny had recovered from his illness. Tiara wrote that Johnny had returned to the rally as an activist and was beaten by the police. But since his body senses had recovered, Johnny couldn't stand being beaten by the police and ran away. All of his followers wondered to see their leader fleeing. The media was also busy reporting it. Johnny then lamented his weakness in a city hall. Tiara came by to greet him and asked him to go back to he used to be. She was pleased because Johnny didn't need to be a hero beaten by the police. But Johnny blames Dr. Riesenberg for treating his illness and making him a coward. Meanwhile, Hazama was furious because Dr. Riesenberg could treat Johnny, while he did not know how to treat Johnny. The following day, Maiko and Hazama were in a class to continue their studies. Shortly after, a doctor entered the room in a wheelchair and put on a robotic hand. The doctor would teach in their class and introduce himself as Maruo Hayaki. He started explaining his theory to medical students until it was finished. Then Hazama greeted and said hello to him. Maiko was a little surprised when she discovered that Hazama knew Dr. Hayaki. The scene then shows Hazama, Maiko, and Dr. Hayaki talking in the cafeteria. Hazama and Dr. Hayaki turned out to have the same dream, which was to be like Dr. Hanma. Hazama himself was known that he was a former patient of Dr. Hanma, while Hayaki was an intern who previously worked with Dr. Hanma. Dr. Hayaki then took Hazama and Maiko to his lab to see the results of his experiments. After arriving at the lab, Hazama saw Dr. Hayaki developing an automatic prosthetic hand as one of his experiments. Hazama and Maiko went around to see the results of the experiments. Soon, there came a woman, Mio, to see Dr. Hayaki. The purpose of Mio's coming was apparently to propose to Dr. Hayaki. But Dr. Hayaki refused because his physical condition did not allow them to be together. However, Mio did not give up, and she kept coming to see him until he accepted her. Meanwhile, Hazama and Maiko, looking at the romantic scene behind the wall, felt moved, congratulating Dr. Hayaki. Maiko then drove Mio home while Hazama stayed in the lab with Dr. Hayaki. Furthermore, Dr. Hayaki said he always remembered a car accident that disabled him. He invited Hazama to go to his room and see the results of his research on connecting artificial body parts. He did all of this to get his arms and legs back, so he could marry Mio. Hazama then inquired about who would be carrying out the primary surgery. Dr. Hayaki replied that his friend, Dr. Takara from Taito University, would operate on him. The following day, Dr. Hayaki accompanied Hazama to visit Dr. Takara. Dr. Hayaki asked Dr. Takara to perform surgery on his hands and feet while showing his research results. But Dr. Hayaki's effort was in vain because Dr. Takara rejected it on the grounds it could kill his career as a doctor. Dr. Hayaki then left Takara's room and came home with Hazama. In the middle of their journey, he told Hazama that his friend didn't want to help him. Hazama volunteered to operate on Dr. Hayaki, and seeing him very frustrated, he agreed. Hazama began to learn about Dr. Hayaki's research to connect the nerves of his arms and legs. Sometime later, Hazama started operating on Dr. Hayaki. He confidently performed the operation alone and successfully without the slightest obstacle. Soon, Dr. Hayaki returned to teach again and continued his daily life. He even was able to dissect his patients again. Dr. Hayaki started his first work by dissecting a corpse for an autopsy. He then got an invitation to dissect the patient at the hospital where he had worked. He was undoubtedly delighted and shared the good news with Mio. His life began to be busy as he used to be, and he also met a boy named Roro, his former patient. But Dr. Hayaki's happiness did not last long because his 3 friends used to tell him that the patient did not want to be operated on because of his creepy appearance. Dr. Hayaki was very disappointed with the cruel reason. He went to Hazama to say he would retire as a doctor and give up his dream. He also told him that he would say goodbye to Dr. Takara first. When Dr. Hayaki came out of the elevator, he saw Dr. Takara with their friends laughing about his downfall. He finally found out that Dr. Takara and others were not friends but enemies. He was outraged and disappointed. After the incident, Dr. Hayaki disappeared from campus. He was also not at Mio's house. So, Mio looked for him in the hospital. She met Hazama and Maiko, but she did not find Dr. Hayaki. Hazama decided to find Dr. Hayaki at Taito University and meet Roro. He needed to learn about Hayaki's whereabouts. On the other hand, Dr. Takara and his friend look for Dr. Tano, who has been missing for a week. Dr. Takara then reported to the police. When Dr. Takara returned home, Dr. Hayaki showed up at his house. Dr. Hayaki said that Dr. Tano was dead. Dr. Hayaki found out that Dr. Takara caused the accident he had. Dr. Takara was also surprised to learn that Dr. Hayaki killed Dr. Tano. Dr. Hayaki explained the chronology of the car accident that he and Tano experienced. He took Tano's right hand, which was broken because of the accident. After that, he asked Dr. Takara to tell the truth while strangling his neck. The scene returns to show Hazama and Maiko walking together. Suddenly, they heard a scream and saw a severely hurt man. When Hazama and Maiko approached him, it turned out that the man was Dr. Takara, who had lost his hand. Hazama provided first aid and took him to the nearest hospital. Finally, Dr. Takara was saved and will soon be operated on. On the other hand, Dr. Hayaki was chasing Dr. Saba Mei, a friend of Dr. Takara. He cut off Dr. Saba's leg and took it, and left, leaving it bleeding. The next day, Mr. Detective went to see Dr. Takara, who was unconscious and very traumatized. Dr. Takara mentioned that Dr. Hayaki had cut off his hand and killed Dr. Tano and Dr. Saba. Mr. Detective also told Hazama, Maiko, and Mio that the police were looking for Dr. Hayaki to kill his friends. Hazama remembered the message from Dr. Hayaki. He said that he wanted to visit the temple. At night, Hazama then went to the temple on the mountain, and he met with Dr. Hayaki, sitting in front of the statue inside the temple. He asked Dr. Hayaki to come back and stop the act of revenge. Dr. Hayaki refused Hazama's request and told the truth. Takara and the hospital director, Daigo, had framed him. Daigo, who was hungry for power and position, made him and his master become victims. Dr. Hayaki's master died because of being trapped. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayaki was made to look like it was an accident, even though his car's brakes had been sabotaged. He told Hazama that there was no way for him to come back. The following day, Hazama came to Dr. Takara and asked for the truth. But the cunning Dr. Takara made fun of Hazama and said he had saved a monster. Hazama was very angry to see the heinous actions of Dr. Takara along with Director Daigo. While Director Daigo was secured by the police and Mr. Detective in his office, Dr. Hayaki came and managed to break through the police's guards to meet Director Daigo in his office. Dr. Hayaki cut off Director Daigo's legs sadistically, brought them, and left. After the incident, the police designated Dr. Hayaki as a fugitive and continued to search for him. At night, Dr. Hayaki went to Hazama and asked him to operate on him. Hazama did it and made a robot eye and asked him not to die. The next day, Dr. Hayaki handed himself over to the police. Dr. Takara gave false testimony without revealing the truth, so Dr. Hayaki was sentenced to death and will soon be executed. In the detention room, Dr. Hayaki released his robotic eyeballs and escaped from prison, thus making the police come back in a rage and hunt him down. The scene turns to Hazama starting his life as a doctor of darkness. He often performed dark operations and was highly paid for his achievements. He met Dr. Hayaki, who was now a fugitive due to political life and a position rooted in the hospital. That also made him lose his way and make his own rules. The next scene shows a student named Eri looking for Hazama at the hospital. Eri saw Hazama behind the trees and thought that he was indeed Hazama. But Eri mistook it, and the one standing there was Maiko resting. Because of her mistaking someone, Eri is then left. On the other hand, Hazama got an illegal job from one of his seniors. Maiko came to see Hazama and said that a little girl was looking for him in the hospital. Hazama understood what Maiko was referring to as Eri and told Maiko how he met Eri. Sometime later, Eri joined the Revolutionary Army for the rebels. Eri went to the army camp with Aoyama and other groups. But after some time in the camp of the Revolutionary Army, she sent letters and photos to Hazama to make him intend to find her. After searching, Hazama found out that Eri was in Gungan Mountain. Soon after, he arrived there and saw Eri's very critical state. He also saw Aoyama, tied up by the revolutionary leader. Hazama then asked what really happened. Aoyama explained that Eri was hurt because of saving herself. The revolution leader finally said that Eri was tortured for not attacking Aoyama. Hazama was angry at them and wanted to treat Eri, but he was tied up instead. Even so, Hazama didn't stay silent and started raving at length, upsetting the revolution leader. He was released and immediately began his operations on Eri, asking other troops for help. Hazama's heroic action began. He tried his best to treat the little girl. The operation lasted until the morning. Finally, Eri was saved. She was awake and happy to see Hazama in the Revolutionary Forces camp. But shortly after, the police surrounded the place, causing the Revolutionary Army to panic. The shootout took place between the Revolutionary Army against the police. The police threw smoke gas at the Revolutionary Army camp. Seeing the situation, Eri intended to stop the fight and get out of the camp, but she was shot. Hazama then left the camp because he saw Eri's body bleeding profusely. Eri apologized to Hazama because she had just been healed, but she had hurt again. Soon, Eri died in peace in Hazama's arms. After the incident, the police arrested deserters and Hazama, who was finally released because he was found not guilty. The anime ended by showing Hazama regaining the offer of surgery from the Dark World. He officially becomes an intern doctor in the hospital and has his license. The offer of the operation came from Tachiri, who is now a mediator for him to get clients who want to operate illegally. Hazama is also more deeply involved in the Dark World because he does not believe in laws and power made by humans. So, from now on, Hazama changes his name to Dr. Young Black Jack. This anime is exciting with the theme of medicine with its unique impression compared to other anime. Hazama's character is also made very realistic, starting with a young man who is determined to become a great doctor but ends up being a doctor with the heart to carry out dirty operations because of his disappointment with the harsh realities of life.